Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I will give it a few seconds as our audience joins today's webinar. Okay. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us. My name is Rania Saadewi and I am the Executive Director at the Pearl Initiative. And thank you so much for joining us today for the new series that Pearl Initiative and NAMA, Women Advancement Establishment, a longtime partner of the Pearl Initiative, is kicking off for the 2021-2022 Women at Work series. Before I explain the series, allow me to explain a little bit about the Pearl Initiative for those who do not know the organization. The Pearl Initiative is the Gulf region's leading independent nonprofit organization working to improve corporate accountability and transparency across the private sector, family firms, small businesses, and philanthropic organizations in the Gulf region. We thank you for joining us today for this unique panel discussion and are pleased to be hosting this in collaboration with NAMA, Women Advancement Establishment. Together with NAMA, the Pearl Initiative has partnered for a long time to conduct regionally based research in the UAE and across the Gulf region, highlighting the business case for diversity in business leadership, and hosting in-person and virtual convenings, workshops, and trainings to promote diversity and inclusion best practices across the private sector. As part of our new Women at Work series, we will be hosting a series of virtual and in-person discussions highlighting the connection between females in leadership and senior level representation and linking it to improved business sustainability and corporate governance. The Women at Work series targets many of you, our audience, diversity and inclusion champions and advocates across the Gulf and Arab world who are leading the way and steering their companies to support gender equity and equality in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goal 5. Today's panel discussion kicks off our series with key experts discussing how gender equality and equity actually fosters business sustainability and economic growth. Our experts today from academia, from research and industry leaders will shed light, first highlighting the difference between gender equality and gender equity, and discussing a lot of best practices to implement and promote inclusive and equitable workplaces, as well as challenges and solutions in implementing such best practices in the workplace. Today's moderator for the session is Dr. Melissa Langworthy. Dr. Melissa is joining us today from Kuwait, and she is a feminist economist focusing on women, work, and entrepreneurship in the Gulf. She has consulted with the American University of Beirut, the Kuwait Women's Union, and the EU Policy Outreach Partnership, as well as the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Melissa is also a research affiliate with Ladysmith. Her current research focuses on the relationship between women's empowerment, entrepreneurship, and the rentier state. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Melissa. Our panelists for today's discussion include Dr. Natalie Hunain, who is the adjunct professor at the American University of Sharjah. For the past 20 years, Dr. Natalie has taught writing at universities, trained teachers, hosted academic conferences, and worked with a number of publishers, focusing on research exploring Arab women's activism in the 20th century, gender issues, refugees, and more recently, indigenous languages. Dr. Natalie is a strong advocate for social equity and has been a guest speaker at a number of universities worldwide. We are honored to have you today on our panel, Dr. Natalie. Joining Dr. Natalie as well is Paula Newby, who is the CEO and founder of Predixa, a leading edge diversity, equity, and inclusion advisory services and technology company. Paula is a serial entrepreneur with over 30 years working with large blue chip firms and SMEs. Paula is an innovative thinker and experienced speaker with excellent ability to lead and inspire at various different levels and brings wide-ranging skills, complemented by deep knowledge in design, retail, manufacturing, and supply chain management. Thank you so much, Paula, for sharing your insights on today's webinar. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Ramez Shahedi, the Managing Director of MENA at Facebook, joining us today. Ramez is an internationally seasoned transformational leader, an industry and technology strategist, thought leader, venture capitalist, and community builder. Ramiz is at the regional helm of a global digital innovation and social media giant, and over the years has started, scaled, and led regional and global lines of business and cross-industry portfolios for a number of top-tier global consulting firms. He has also built and led social responsibility programs and actively participates in community leadership initiatives with the aim to deliver positive change on essential themes such as empowerment of women, environmental preservation, and social entrepreneurship, amongst other various socioeconomic issues. Thank you again to all of our moderators and esteemed panelists for taking the time to share your expertise, experience, and hopefully a lively debate today. Before I turn it over to Dr. Melissa, I want to extend to the audience, as many of you know, and I see that we have a lot of return attendees, we always aim to make our sessions as interactive as possible. So we encourage you, the audience, to ask questions, comments, thoughts, using the Q&A function throughout the discussion. During the panel discussion, Dr. Melissa and our panelists will do their best to answer as many questions as they can throughout the session, as well as in the last 10 minutes for the dedicated Q&A session. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Melissa. Over to you.
Thank you, Rania, and welcome everybody. I was thinking this morning how it was 1978, so 43 years ago, that a woman named Marilyn Loden first coined the term the glass ceiling. And I think that in that time, our understanding of women at work, coupled with the global shifts towards sustainability and growth focus, have really developed the idea that women at work is no longer just the glass ceiling, that it's an integrated, it's a business environment, it's a social environment issue, and it's rapidly shifting and changing along with global politics, economics, health, and the like. So, Dr. Natalie, why are we still talking about gender equality in the 21st century? What are the challenges? What's the history for women in the workplace?
Thank you, Dr. Melissa. Hello, everyone, and I'm really happy to be here and honored to be part of this group. So maybe a bit of history is a good idea. As we all know, throughout the history of this region, there's been innumerable strong and influential women that emerged in every corner of the Arab world. But it wasn't until modern times, so starting in the 19th century, that women's voices were heard and documented. And this came with the rise of publishing, which kept a record of women's work, their words, and their speeches. So women such as Zainab Fawaz, Malak Hifni Nasif, Aisha Taimuriya, May Ziadeh, Huda Sha'rawi, they were the pioneers that set the stage in motion for women's inclusion in Arab society. They were writers and activists, and they voiced their opinion orally and in writing. As a result, women in the Levant region, where they came from, earned the right to vote. They earned access to education and the freedom to work outside the home. But a century after this bottom-up approach to change, there are still two areas that are strangely inaccessible for Arab women, and that is politics and leadership. But if we look at this region, so in the GCC, things were done very differently. Today, the UAE specifically benefits from having a top-down approach to women's inclusion in the workforce, more specifically women in government and leadership, exactly what is missing in the Levant region. And this change, this top-down, is currently driven by men, keeping that in mind. Yes, by exemplary leadership, but also by husbands and fathers and brothers who often need to provide their consent. But as a result, the country has been able, in its own way, to pave the way for women's inclusion and leadership. And I would say that's just a brief on the history. I hope that helps, Dr. Melissa.
No, wonderful. Thank you. So women's inclusion in leadership is a wonderful statement to end that comment on. And I think that sometimes during these discussions, right, words like inclusion would not have been around 40 years ago when we started this discussion. And I think there's been a development of other terms as well, right? Gender equality is often used, right? We say it's a driver for sustainability. We say it's a driver for economic growth. It's a driver for companies. And yet sometimes I think we don't quite understand what that means, right? I think there's people that say, what is gender equality? And then there's the sister term, gender equity, which, gender equality is our goal. Gender equality is, empowering women, ensuring decision-making and leadership and inclusion, as you said, Dr. Natalie. Whereas gender equity is often the strategies and tools that we use to get there, the strategies and tools that we use to create the equality and address the historical challenges that women have faced. So Paula, what are the other misconceptions? What are the issues that you see coming up in these terms of equality and equity on a practical level?
I have to remember to unmute. Yes, delighted to be with you, and thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding between these two terms, and some of the others. But very briefly, gender equality is very much about giving people the same opportunities, treating people, giving them the opportunities to be treated equally, etc. So, I mean, an obvious one would be in terms of equal pay. If you've got two people who are equally qualified, who are doing the same job and are achieving the same results, then why shouldn't they be paid equally? Whereas gender equity is about the treatment of people according to their gender. So an obvious one would be that, for instance, if female workforce are pregnant, then they need to be given the time to go to, their prenatal tests and that sort of thing. Obviously, men are not going to be offered that unless, of course, they wish to accompany their wife. But so gender equality is about, giving people the same opportunities, really. Gender equity is treating them according to their specific need. And a couple of other terms I just want to expand on. We've spoken about women's empowerment, and it's very interesting that we find sometimes we get quite a resistance to this term from both men and women, actually. And we were talking to a client just the other day, and there were 3 women in management, and they said, well, we find that quite an insulting term. We don't feel we need to be empowered, I mean, they were in management sort of thing. And I pointed out, well, yeah, maybe for you, but I wonder what about some of the women sort of further down the tree. Are they feeling as empowered as you are? But the definition of women's empowerment is to give women the means, the skills, and the opportunities for them to be able to take control of their lives, to be able to make their own choices and reach their own potential, their true potential, to be able to contribute to society. And it's not about taking anything away from men. I think the fact that word has got the word power in it, that's not a word that's normally associated with women. Perhaps that's why some women find it uncomfortable. And then that word as well, with that power, in some men think, is this some sort of battle of the sexes? No, of course it isn't. This is about helping women to realize their full potential. So that's women's empowerment. And then the other thing that Dr. Natalie was mentioning, and yourself, Dr. Melissa, in terms of inclusion, we see so often that people, we talk about diversity and inclusion, and so often people focus in on the diversity element and they forget the inclusion bit. And what does that mean? An inclusive culture in an organization is one where people feel valued, where people can bring their whole self to work, where when they speak, they will be listened to, they won't be judged, and that they feel that they can express their opinions, even if it is different to perhaps their managers. They won't be therefore discriminated against. There will be no recriminations for what they have said. And it's when you have an inclusive culture, in our opinion, we need to start with an inclusive culture, and I hold my hands like this, like a cradle, because that supports the diverse workforce to enable the diversity of thought to bubble to the surface, where people can be treated equally and with equity.
Thank you, Paula, for that impassioned explanation. But we've addressed then, you addressed very well these comments and experiences on an individual level. But globally, there's been a lot of attention at the company level, right? At the firm level. There's been a lot of research and interest on the business case for why, why should a business be involved in concepts like gender equity and gender equality? So Ramez, how have these practices for gender equality and inclusion benefited international businesses in your experience?
Fantastic question. And I'm just thinking that Paula's answer was absolutely brilliant, and Natalie's intro for the domain is incredible, incredibly rich, and I feel absolutely humbled and honored to be among these fantastic experts. So thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here as well. Look, the question is a very deep question. And I think it has so many facets to it. But at its core, I think maybe if I reflect a little bit on Facebook's attitude towards this as perhaps an indicator of where business is going and where industries are going, noting that the gaps are very big overall in terms of the progress, as was highlighted earlier. We're constantly solving problems, iterating, working together with people all over the world, from all kinds of backgrounds and cultures and orientations, physical, intellectual, spiritual, emotional. And how we avail ourselves as a platform to the world, giving people the opportunity to connect, is an essential ingredient for us. And I think as a takeaway from that, when businesses have a sense of their purpose, of their mission, for the constituents that they serve, there is a surge, there's a magnification that happens when your workforce and your environment embrace the communities that you ultimately are in the service of, whether you're developing products or you're developing services or providing those services. So as a company, we aim to reflect the planet. We aim to reflect the communities that we serve. And so diversity is incredibly important in bringing in all the facets of the communities that we serve, that we look at problems and we iterate from all angles. Singularity of view is highly problematic because inevitably you build bias, you build gaps into your product or your service. So very important that our workforce reflects the diversity of people that we serve. And hiring people of different backgrounds and points of view helps us make better decisions. Groupthink is ultimately extremely dangerous in this regard. So it helps us to design better products and build better experiences that do not marginalize. And we don't always get it right. Even with so much of a focus on this, inevitably, bias makes its way in, and we need to capture it constantly, capture it and iterate and work through it. But communities bring the world closer together. I mean, that's kind of our mantra, right? It transcends borders. We need to overcome obstacles to unite neighbors, friends, families, and people everywhere. And so the world is increasingly relying on platforms like ours to build community. And to Paula's point, that diversity often isn't enough. In fact, it is just half or a part of the equation. Inclusion becomes a necessary element. And if a business is going to think about it commercially, there is a significant commercial impact to inclusion. Right? I think Jim Collins, if you haven't read Good to Great, you should. It's a good exploration of the power of unlocking people's potential. And in there, you know, this notion of people having a sense of where you're going. Yeah, what's the sense of destination and my part in that destination? I start to feel and operate as an owner. Yeah, I operate as having a vested stake, that I drive impact. My cog in the wheel becomes clear. Yeah, and when people have that sense of inclusion, there's a multiplier. There's an amplification, and that amplification brings benefit to culture, to spirit, to economics, and it has incredible impact on an organization. So diversity and inclusion with a sense of destiny and one's role in it is benefiting businesses locally, regionally, and globally.
Ramez, I feel like you just used words to describe Paula's wonderful hand gesture here. So we're all sitting, if we worked for you, we'd be sitting in this little hammock that we can now take with us, hopefully. But no, that's an amazingly lyrical way to discuss this impact, right? Of changing stakeholders and how changing the concept of stakeholders and how we interact with them can ultimately provide a pathway to improving some of these practices. But that still sounds fairly, you know, talk in the sky. It's, again, very beautiful. So Paula, with your experience with Gulf countries, what's a practice? What's something a little more tangible that this can look like in a day-to-day practice?
Sorry, I get so enthusiastic, I forget to turn off my mute. Yeah, so some of the clients that we've been working with, and to give you an illustration, but following on perfectly with some of the issue that the points that Ramez made is that some of the clients that we're working with, one of the first things that we do in order to understand the inclusivity of the culture and where they sit at the moment is often to start to tease out in workshops about analyzing the purpose of the organization. You know, what does it really stand for? Because once you establish what that is, then everybody can really get behind that, and they recognize they become more engaged and they feel included, you know, inclusive. And of course, the important thing to get true engagement is that you need to ensure that your workforce and your company, the purpose is aligned, because if you've got the purpose, your moral compass of the individual is aligned with the moral compass of the organization, then you achieve engagement. And when you have truly engaged workforce, as Ramez says, the implications are extraordinary. I mean, the research shows there's a 4 times increase in employee satisfaction, and people are prepared to go the extra mile. A couple of other things I would say. I know we're going to be talking about sort of COVID later, but of course, one of the other practices that some of the businesses here have engaged in is recognizing that the workplace flexibility, i.e. working from home, you know, the sky didn't fall down. Pre-pandemic, everybody said, no, you've got to be in the office, you've got to be seen. And then, of course, with the working from the lockdown and working from home, of course, you know, it worked very well. Obviously, it depended on whether your role, your job was something you could do at home. But and it drove a different type of management, a style of management. And I think it forced many managers, executives to take a much more sort of empathetic approach. And another example, actually, that one of our clients did was he was CFO, and he used to take his lunch in his room at his desk, you know, and And then through the lockdown, he started to have virtual lunches with his teams. And the rule was, you know, everyone would come on Zoom and have lunch together, and you were not allowed to talk about business. And it was a chance for him to really, really get to know and connect with his teams. And that probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't have had the situation. But it's driving this more empathetic approach, and leaders perhaps realizing that it's not about the hours you spend in the office anymore. It's about, right, here's the job you have to do. Here are your targets. This is what we want you to achieve. How you achieve it, is up to you. And we're giving you the responsibility, and we're taking the mature approach to realize that can be done. So in terms of examples and practices, that the work from home thing has worked well in benefiting a more empathetic approach to leadership, which has benefited. But this sort of finding your purpose has absolutely kicked off the way that we can find that inclusive culture.
Wonderful. Sounds like some great things growing out of a very trying situation.
But inclusive culture and economic gain. That this translates from a qualitative view into a quantitative impact as well, right? If companies don't always have to think about this, rightly or wrongly, from an altruistic perspective, there is an economic aspect to this that has unleashing potential, magnifying potential. Sorry.
No, very true. Thank you. I was just going to build, though, this idea of a more empathetic workplace. Again, we're in that lyrical, lovely place. I think a lot of times, especially with something like a quota, these policies, the outcomes of gender equality objectives can sometimes interfere with that feeling of empathy and cohesion in the workplace. Dr. Natalie, what's your experience told us on how to manage that balance?
I think for women's inclusion in the workplace and for a healthier society as a whole, I believe in quotas. And I know this is controversial and some people might disagree. In quotas and in continuing to implement the quotas, I see that they've played a huge role in including women in leadership positions, not only here, but in countries around the world. We all know that already. There's the usual suspects, Norway, Finland, Germany, Iceland, but there's also Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, where they've had and they still have quotas, and it's made a huge difference. Even in Africa, we know Rwanda, what happened after the genocide, Burundi, Tanzania, these countries all have it in there and it's working. There are some countries in the Middle East who have attempted, some still have it, but really they've been negligible, the results. But it's not just quotas for the sake of quotas. I do believe that where we implement quotas and for how long is really the key thing to look at. So in order not to alienate the men that we need to be on our side, and this is based on some research I did with some CEOs, we should implement quotas only in sectors and fields that still need it, that really need it. So for example, a communications company that is predominantly run by women may not need quotas, or the education sector may not need quotas at every level. But quotas need to be industry specific. And for how long? I believe that quotas are important for a limited period of time until it becomes normalized for society to see women in leadership as a fact of life. Until the young generation of girls have enough role models to see where every time they look up that there are women. And so the role models give them something to aspire to and to emulate. It may take a generation or 10 years of quotas, but that's because mindsets need time to change. And unfortunately, change in this part of the region moves at snail-like speed. So quotas for me is one way to go about it, for sure.
Wonderful. And it's certainly something that's been highlighted by some of the international agendas, right? SDG 5 on gender equality. It's been 6 years since they've launched the SDGs. We're 26 years out of Beijing. So these are obviously conversations that have been happening for a while. Why is it important, again, if for the case of a business, for a company, to engage with these international, development, equality, we're here just to be a company. What does this mean for us? Paula, any thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, I think there are a number of factors. I mean, SDG 5 is good for the bottom line. Ramez has just spoken about that. It's good for the inclusivity of the culture. It's good for growth, sales, which obviously impacts the bottom line. But I mean, it's being driven right now by a number of things. We know that women have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and I'm sure we'll be talking about some of those things later. But one of the other issues is that demographically, we have the millennials and the Generation Zs. Now, they are effectively aged between about 17 and early 40s. They are projected to represent between 10 and 75% of the global workforce in the next 10 to 15 years. And these individuals, as was mentioned earlier, they come from, they want to work in organizations that reflect the world that they see. They want to work for sustainable organizations. What is a sustainable organization? One that makes profit. Of course, they know a business has to make profit, but it also works for the benefit of both the environment and society. They do not want to work for organizations. The sole reason is to, increase the wealth of a few individuals. And this comes back down to my earlier point about purpose. And so this agenda is being driven by these two very, very important demographic groups. Of course, also we've had the Black Lives Matter, we've had the Me Too movement, and we've had, obviously with the lockdown, that many people felt disconnected with their workplace cultures and are looking for some of these issues to reconnect. So that's what's driving this agenda and has increased the pace. But in terms of on a business level, the research is very clear. It shows that, for instance, with a higher share of women in the boardroom, you get a 41% better return on equity. There's a 56% better return on operating results. If you've got one woman in the boardroom, then women throughout the organization have a 23% better chance of being promoted. If you have a gender diverse companies, they've shown a 15% better performance of those non-gender diverse companies. And if you have 10% of female managers, then there's likely to be up to 40% increase in sales when compared to companies with 5% female managers. And then, women in the workplace themselves, we've spoken just a little earlier about the impact on the inclusivity of the culture and how people feel they get better job satisfaction, they're better committed to the company, they have better focus on the job in hand, there's less absenteeism. You don't have to spend so much on recruitment because staff are retained for longer, and all of these impact on your bottom line, your profitability. And even, Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, in his letter to his shareholders last year, he said that he was really behind women in the boardroom and women's empowerment because he could see the benefit for it. And then there's some other fantastic research that I saw, and that was about the impact of women in actually purchasing decisions, and that actually in developed economies, 70% of purchases are made by women. And when some of those break down, it's found that 68% of car purchases are made by women. This is in developed economies, of course, where most women drive, and so you would expect it to be close to 50%, but 68%. 94% of food decisions made by women, et cetera, et cetera. But then, so clearly what you've got here is your target market is dominated in terms of decision-making by women. And yet, extraordinarily in the research that I read, and we're seeing it as well when we're discussing with clients, that 91% of the women that were interviewed said that neither their marketing campaigns or the products themselves seem to meet their needs. So you have this sort of complete mismatch, don't you? You've got your target market up here saying we're going to make the decisions, but the marketing campaigns and the products are not hitting what they need. So if we come back to SDG 5, gender equality, women's empowerment, if, as we were talking about, I'm going to use it again, we've got our inclusive culture, we have our diverse workforce, the diversity of thought is being allowed to bubble to the front, to the top, and an organization that taps into their female workforce to find out, better insight into what their customers want, all these women who are making their decisions, then maybe instead of doing that, it would do that. So on sort of virtually every level, having this inclusive culture that respects and allows the diversity of thought to come to the surface, it impacts your better understanding for innovation, it drives better understanding of your target market, what your competitors are doing, it reduces absenteeism, you're not spending so much on your reputation improves, so you don't spend so much on recruitment, etc., etc., etc. It's all about the bottom line, and that's where we focus. So sustainable business has to make a profit, yes, but give it a purpose, have your inclusive culture, and support your diversity in your workforce. And then, frankly, the sky's the limit.
The sky's the limit, of course. Then the research is there. Yes, this is what we've all been saying. This is what we're hearing. Yes. The research is there from not just the international sense, but at the firm level. So, Dr. Natalie, with all of this research, with this clear evidence of why businesses should care, why do we still see such challenges to women's representation in the workplace, especially in this region?
So yeah, I think 3 points I'd like to make about that. I think the main challenge is the lack of equity and equality within the home. And I think anyone who is a mother particularly would understand what that means. Single mom, single women maybe have a different experience, or just married women, it's fine, but it's motherhood that really tips the balance. And what this means is a healthy and equitable domestic life is a prerequisite for professional success for women. In other words, if the home functions well, the job functions well. And until there's change within the family dynamics, a woman's professional life and her advancement will be restricted, and the two are intertwined. Sheryl Sandberg said that the most important decision a woman can make for her professional career is her choice in life partner or husband or spouse. And I believe that even in arranged marriages, which is still very common here in the region, life partner or husband is still the most important factor. But I would add to it as well, fathers, maybe for single women, and that's the most important determinant for professional success, but also their academic success before that. But not just life partner; it has to be its true parenting partnership. And this is, if we don't have true parenting partnerships, the working mothers will continue to struggle in balancing the two spheres of their lives. So that's one. And the second thing is family planning policies. And these are usually enforced by governments or businesses. Again, very important missing challenge often. So by implementing family-friendly policies, everyone benefits, not just the women, but the men and families as a whole. So for instance, implementing laws that allow women to work from home, and we've mentioned that, we've touched on it already. Women and men clearly are working from home and have worked from home, and it was tested during this COVID. And I find, as Paula said, that it was very beneficial, and it either improved the efficiency or at least it stayed the same. But I have more to say about this in case it comes up later. Another example of family planning is paid and required family leave for both parents, for both fathers and mothers. And I say family leave, not maternal leave and not paternal leave, because by forcing it, if you will, on both parents to take time off, it prevents discrimination in the hiring process, and resentment towards one employee who's been off for 5 months or 4 months or whatever. So, and I say paid for obvious reasons. So honoring the needs of the family is important, and it's the needs of every member of the family. Because if that happens, then the workplace culture will change and the balance within society will change for the better. A third point I would want to make is another thing that holds women back is also sometimes it's their own hesitation and lack of courage in one sense. And I'll tell you what. Studies show that graduates in the UAE, 70% of them are women, right? And this is very admirable by any standards. And I could speak for what I see here at university. The students, the female local students, are incredibly driven.
But on the other hand, sorry, 1 second.
But on the other hand, can you hear me? Just give me, okay. But on the other hand, 50% of these young women graduates do not go into the workforce. And it makes you wonder, while men go right into the workforce after graduation, but 50% of these women do not. So it makes you wonder why. Is it the lack of courage to enter the workforce, or is it them waiting for marriage maybe, or is it about maybe restrictions that the parents or family members put on them to stay home rather than be out in the workplace? So what we need to do, I think, and that would be helpful, is to create programs that support and encourage these young women to enter the workforce after they graduate. For example, programs that help build their specific skills, which builds confidence. The programs can also foster conversations about the benefits of them working outside the home. Clearly, we know the benefits, that the mind stays healthy and challenged, that the woman would have financial independence. It's not enough to be sleeping on family wealth, and how working outside the home gives them, it empowers them. I was trying not to use that word, but it also gives them a voice within their communities and within their homes as well. So yes, there are a few things that are still holding us back and that are challenges, and I hope we can overcome soon.
So Dr. Natalie, please, can we just take you back when you were talking about women, when your mic cut out, you were saying that they were driven and you left us hanging, so.
Sorry, repeat that because you just got cut off. At what part?
When your mic cut out, when you switched your headphone, you had been making a point that we couldn't hear just previous to that.
Okay, was it about saying the paid and required family leave? Was that it? Or was it when I got to education and students at universities?
Yeah.
Yes, that bit. Yeah.
Okay, so the students at universities, that studies show that 70% of college graduates here are women, which is amazing, but only 50% of them actually enter the workforce. And that's problematic. And I don't know if you caught me from here moving forward. And I feel that we need to create programs for these women to encourage them to enter the workforce. And maybe even within these programs, it could be, we can also address the families and teach the families or have conversations with the families about the importance of their daughters being in the workforce as well. So many, many challenges. Did I cover? Does it make sense now?
So yes, addressing what's being called the MENA paradox is obviously a very important step to ensure, right, that these girls are switching from education into the workforce, which would be something of national importance, right? If we're talking about sustainability and economic growth. You've mentioned policy and regulatory frameworks, so it seems that the state should also have an interest in promoting gender equality. So Ramez, what have you seen in terms of national interest and national economy and with regards to gender equality?
Great question. And again, I think the answers from Dr. Natalie and Paula have been incredibly rich in shedding light on that perspective. And I'll maybe throw out a few more complementary stats in this regard, because unequivocally, there is a significant impact when investing in and establishing greater equality and greater equity with economic progress. Similarly to the narrative around a particular company's change and surge forward. But maybe to give a tagline to it, when women do better, economies do better. Simply. When women are successful, they employ more women. They act as great role models, as we've heard. They encourage more diversity. They're more resilient. They're more adaptable. They invest in the community. They educate their children. They pay back the benefits they receive by helping others. Women are just better in general, in every aspect. And I think, maybe looking at some of the stats from the UN and from the IMF will put even more color to this. So let me highlight a few things. And I have to say the UN and IMF and many others have been reporting on this, and the link is very clear that greater gender equality and women empowerment does boost economic growth. And in fact, the projection is that that there could be trillions of dollars in gain in GDP over the coming years. So when looking at the OECD states, increasing female employment rates to match that of Sweden, by way of example, could boost GDP in the OECD by over $6 trillion alone. And recognizing that growth does not automatically lead to a reduction of gender-based inequality. Right? It's an important nuance. Conversely, it's estimated that gender gaps cost the economy some 15% of GDP in the current state. Increased educational attainment accounts for 50% of economic growth in OECD countries over the past 50 years, but as Dr. Natalie very clearly pointed out, for the majority of women, significant gains in education have not translated into better labor market outcomes. And while perhaps some of the stats generally in the GCC have a positive trend, the disparity between the best and the least is quite remarkable. And if we look at the value chain, it's also quite telling. Sourcing from women-owned enterprises can strengthen the brand and improve access to premium markets. One more woman in senior management on the corporate board, as Paula pointed out, is associated with 8 to 13 basis points higher return on assets. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to have financial returns above national industry means. Women make or influence 80% of buying decisions, which translates to over $20 trillion in global spending.
Wow.
And a commitment to women can enhance a company's reputation and brand and all of that sense of inclusivity and resonance, I would say, in the corporate culture. More than 1 in 3 private sector leaders report increased profits following efforts to empower women in emerging markets. And in the spirit of the metaverse, and maybe you're hearing about this more and more, it's sort of the mashup, the collision between digital and physical, where it becomes more and more blurred. Let me give you sort of the sense from within the metaverse, the digital view of things. 20% of Instagram business profiles created since November 2020 mention the word female or women-owned. 70% of brand purchasing decisions on or through our platforms are made by women. 72% of men and women say most advertising does not yet reflect the world around them. And brands that deliver progressive ads have higher purchase intent of more than 25% for all consumers and 45% for women. In fundraising, globally in 2020, I got to hit some of these. Dr. Melissa. They're really juicy.
So pick the best ones.
I'll land them quickly.
Okay.
Women created twice as many fundraisers on Facebook as men and made twice as many donations. And 64% of the total amount fundraised in 2020 came from women. And when it comes to COVID, because I know this is an important topic for us to be talking about, women have used platforms to rally resources and avail resources dramatically. There are 2.7 times more COVID-related groups generated and created by women than there are by men, and that those groups on average have 4 times the number of members. And I want to highlight maybe one last thing as you move on, is that when it comes to peace and stability, okay, I wonder how many women have started wars. I mean, if you take a step back, women are peacemakers. They bring people together. They'd make a cup of tea
and sit down, wouldn't they? Sit down and chat over a cup of tea.
And
Dr. Melissa, you need to give us more time. Like an hour is not enough for this.
It wasn't much, I know.
Okay,
well,
I'll be quiet.
You bring a very timely point as well, right? The cover of The Last Economist was why nations that fail women fail,
yes,
right?
yes.
This is, and as we've discussed in this hour, gender equality is never just about women. It's political, it's economic, it's social and the like. So we've had a couple of questions. We've had one on gender mainstreaming. So Ima has asked, recently come across the term gender mainstreaming and would like to know how the approach helps actually addressing a disparity or disparities in the workplace. Dr. Natalie, I think for you, we had a question from Nada. Why are women not joining the workforce, and is it actually a choice? Can we say with different forms of coercion or social norms or other kind of barriers, are we saying that they don't want to work? Are we saying it's what's your understanding of that motivation? And then I would like for you to each just think about a final comment or takeaway, and we'll go from there. So potentially, Dr. Natalie, we'll start with you since that was a fairly direct question, and then we'll move on.
Okay, so I asked the same question. I asked the same question, that what is it that holds these women back? And I haven't done the research, but for me, it was, could it be lack of courage to be out in the workforce, because it is not an easy thing? Could it be that they're waiting for marriage? That could be a second possibility, which has been what women have done for centuries, right? Or is it about restrictions that the parents placed on them? And this is a big thing here in this region, of course, with parents telling their daughters, no, they cannot go. I'd offered, I thought maybe by creating some kind of programs just for support, for information, it would help women come out of it. But we need to remember that. And I think within the home, within each of our homes, to think of our own daughters, our sisters, or our neighbors, and push them to go out into the workforce. It's not enough to have degrees, to collect them, to put them up on a wall. The woman has to make that leap and jump out into the workforce, because that's where financial independence comes in. That's where every aspect of your life will be affected positively. So the reasons, I'm not yet sure. Something needs to be done.
I know in Kuwait, we've been addressing, there's been some great initiatives in terms of creating this pathway to the workforce in terms of apprenticeships and internships. Linking colleges, and especially all female colleges, with companies to get experience, right? So that you can show, that I have experience in the workplace, I can come and be an effective part of the team. So I think something like that potentially works on both sides, right? Both in terms of the workplace perspective and in terms of the individual perspective of the young women.
And I would add into that also the power of mentoring, and to get a program of mentors, female mentors to mentor females, but let's also do female mentors to mentor men as well, because then that aids the understanding and adds to the inclusivity of the culture. But certainly to try to get mentors to support women when they come into the workplace, particularly if there are cultural issues that they may be struggling with.
Excellent.
So do you mind if I just jump in as well?
Sure.
And I would not judge a woman that decides not to go into the workforce, right? I will not judge her harshly, because it is, as we've been told, a choice. Choice to get into the workforce or not, choice to get married or not, right? But I believe that word choice is really questionable anyway. What does it mean to have a choice when everything we see around us influences our choices? So if my mother never worked, or my neighbor never worked, and my sister didn't go working, she just got married and she's doing fine. That was her choice, but this determines your own choice, right? It's what you see around you. So people can choose not to work for some time, but I am a strong, strong believer that even with a family, we need to be able to have something outside the home. And I think mothers come to that realization very soon after having children. So at first it's all pretty and, flowers and sunny skies, but once you have children and you're doing that, then you're like, okay, but there has to be more. My language has to go beyond diapers and maids and feeding the baby. And that's where working outside the home you'll see a big difference with time. So maybe now young women don't see it. Sorry.
I think too, this ties back to our beginning discussion on equity and equality, right? It's about creating pathways, reducing resistance, reducing barriers, so that those choices can be freely taken, right? By whomever would like to do so, right? So Ramez, potentially, can you address the gender mainstreaming question from is there a Facebook perspective or in your other capacities? Or Paula might also jump into this too.
On mute?
Yeah, you're good.
Go ahead, Paula.
No, it's fine.
Look, I think the answers have been, again, incredibly rich, and maybe if I share a perspective that I recently read, I think it for me really highlights this notion of the crucible of us coming together, that we have a shared destiny and that we are partners in this destiny. In a nice quote, so let me share it, or at least I thought it was. It says, if two people always agree, it's a sign that at least one of them may not be thinking critically or speaking candidly. Differences of opinion don't have to be threats. They can be opportunities to learn. Intellectual friction isn't a relationship bug. It's a feature of education and growth. And I think in the spirit of inclusion and diversity, sharing voice, being authentic, expressing oneself, having confidence, choosing and expressing are absolutely essential ingredients. We all need to play our part in helping to thrive in whatever organization, institution we may be part of, whether at home, for economies at large, in the workplace, or in our communities.
Well, I can't think of a better way to sum up a wonderful discussion. I thank you all for your contributions. I know there wasn't enough time, so please feel free to engage in the chat, speakers and participants, and put your thoughts there. Hopefully we've stirred up some wonderful thoughts and energy and kind of actions then into this environment and into this region that we all call home. So I thank you all very much for joining. I'm going to hand off to Rania for a lovely conclusion as only Pearl Initiative can provide. So thank you all and have a lovely day.
Thank you really, Dr. Melissa, our esteemed and fearless moderator, as well as our esteemed panelists, Dr. Natalie, Paula, and Ramez, for such a thought-provoking and really enriching discussion. Certainly, as many mentioned, this conversation is just the beginning of many that we hope to have over the next couple of months. We see that there are a lot of questions. They might not have been answered on the webinar, but we will be sharing the outcome report and answering a lot of these questions and posting it on our website, as well as following up with all our attendees with this information. Going forward as well, we encourage you, our audience, to reach out to us for more specific topics and areas. Upcoming sessions will delve deeper into some of the topics that we covered here in more depth, including leadership accountability. How do we hold leadership accountable to equity and equality as discussed today in a practical manner, but also workshops on conscious and unconscious bias. Many of our panelists today discuss this unconscious bias because we cannot understand the experience of others. So how can corporations set up different ways to make sure to overcome certain parts of unconscious and conscious bias that occurs? In addition, a lot on working with HR professionals to create a more gender inclusive place where there is internal feedback. And finally, but not least, of course, is this discussion on mentorship and talent development between woman to woman, woman to men, men to woman, and really making this more inclusive. Thank you very much for all of your time. Certainly do reach out to the Pearl Initiative with any follow-up questions or to sign up for our upcoming sessions through our social media channels, our website, and our email. And we wish everyone a wonderful day. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you again. Bye, everyone.